The Realm of the Beasts. An other-dimensional world where, 1 million years ago, a group of powerful mystical creatures rose up. Laying waste to their home and those who inhabited it, these 7 great beasts trapped the souls of their victims in a pit of ultimate sadness before turning their attention towards other worlds. Eventually, 1,000 or more years ago, they found a way to pass the dimensional veil to Earth, and launched an attack on the planet. However, as the great beasts emerged in the frozen north, they were opposed by a pantheon of gods known as the Inuwa, who drove them back on 3 separate occasions. The Inuwa attempted to seal the beasts behind a mystical barrier, but the great beast known as Tundra generated a magical vortex that reflected some of their spell's energies. As a result, the great beasts were trapped in their extra-dimensional realm, but so were the Inuwa, leaving the frozen north without its defenders. And that, true believers, is where this week's story begins. Hey heroes, welcome to another maple-scented episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week we begin our tale in the great northern nation of Canada, where we must introduce some of the key players in today's drama. First, let's look at Eugene Milton Judd. Born in Saskatoon in 1914, Eugene was a man with a thirst for knowledge and a passion for adventure. Standing at an impressive height of 6'6", he became an international mercenary, leading to his involvement in the Spanish Civil War. In 1937, shortly before the bombing of Guernica, he befriended the American novelist Ernest Hemingway. He also joined forces with the masked adventurer Captain Terror and aided his attempts to oppose the fascist forces of Francisco Franco. Although after a failed assault on Franco's stronghold in 1939, both men barely escaped alive. Later that year, Eugene Judd was hired to steal an artifact called the Black Blade of Baghdad. Intrigued by the alleged mystical qualities of the enigmatic treasure, Eugene agreed and infiltrated the tower where it was being kept. And upon seeing the blade, Eugene decided that he would keep it for himself. However, as his hand touched the hilt, a dark presence spewed forth. An ancient sorcerer named Black Razor, who had been trapped in the blade centuries prior by Persian mystics. Razor struck quickly, his sword passing through his foe's body and draining some of Eugene's life force. The Canadian adventurer survived the attack but quickly realized that the theft of energy had made him physically shorter, compressing his mass. He also realized that Razor was too dangerous to allow him to go free. Accepting his own culpability in releasing the sorcerer, Eugene attacked head-on and was skewered by the Black Blade. Using lessons he had learned from other mystics during his travels, he trapped Razor inside his own body, replacing the sword as the sorcerer's prison. When all was said and done, Eugene was reduced to a height of 3'6", but with his body tissue magically compressed, his muscles gained the consistency of condensed rubber, vastly increasing his strength and durability. He continued his adventurous life after that, keeping Razor held captive while he adapted to his new size, relearning his gymnastic and martial arts skills. Racked with pain due to Razor's attempts to escape, he also learned meditation and yoga techniques to further fortify his mind and body, forcing the sorcerer into dormancy. As the decades passed, he also found that his aging had been slowed to a virtual standstill. Throughout his adventures, he visited the other-dimensional realm, Crystallium, and befriended a Canadian hero who fought in World War II, Major Maple Leaf. He eventually had a daughter named Zusha Yu, but was forced to give her up when she was still an infant. Taking the code name Puck, he later ran with a group of criminal mercenaries called the Outcasts, but left after beginning to feel guilty over abusing lessons he had learned from peaceful monks. We next turn our attention to an archaeologist named Richard Lawrence Easton, who was stationed on a dig site north of the Arctic Circle. While there, Easton unearthed a strange metal headband, little realizing that it had been left behind by the great beast Tundra. Richard was ecstatic by what he'd found, but his colleagues were more cautious, wary of misidentifying the relic or drawing false conclusions. The headband was logged and filed with the other discoveries in the storage tent, but that night Richard Easton found himself unable to sleep. In some way he couldn't fully understand, Easton found himself drawn to Tundra's headband and placed it on his brow. As he did, he was contacted by 3 members of the Inuwa, who were able to communicate with him thanks to the mystical artifact. Nelvana, goddess of the Northern Lights, declared her intention to mate with Easton, producing a hybrid child who could pass through the barrier and defend the Earth from the great beasts. While normally appearing as a wise old woman, Nelvana's appearance was altered by Turok the Shaper, so that she could more easily seduce the mortal man. Easton agreed to spend the night with Nelvana and was drawn into the Inua's realm of Quidlavun, but did not return the following morning. And so now we turn our attention to a young man named James MacDonald Hudson, or Mac for short. Born in London, Ontario, James was scientifically gifted from a young age with a general love of science. More specifically, his skills were in engineering, as demonstrated by a cybernetic control helmet he designed while still in college. After earning his PhD, he took a job with the Amcan Petroleum Company in Edmonton, Alberta. Working under the Vice President of R&D, Jerry Jackson, James Hudson began designing an armored suit to dig for geological resources, using his cybernetic helmet as an interface. We'll come back to Mac in a bit, but first let's introduce another important character, Michael Two Young Men. Born on the Sarcee Indian Reserve near Calgary, Alberta, Michael was descended from a long line of mystics, but had little interest in his heritage. After his father passed away, his grandfather attempted to pass on his knowledge, but Michael refused and renounced his claim to it. Instead, he pursued a career in medicine and became celebrated as one of the most successful surgeons in Canada. He married a woman named Catherine, and the couple had a daughter, Elizabeth. Growing up in Calgary, Elizabeth Two Young Men lived next door to another important character in today's story, Heather McNeil. The daughter of a Catholic couple, Ramsey and Claire McNeil, Heather grew up helping her parents look after her many siblings. However, things in the neighborhood changed when Catherine Two Young Men fell ill and was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Michael threw himself into his work in an attempt to find a cure, but ultimately to no avail. In the end, Dr. Michael Two Young Men lost both his wife and his grandfather on the same day. Both he and Elizabeth were overcome with grief, and the young girl, who was only 4 years old at the time, blamed him for not being able to save her mother. The McNeil family offered to take Elizabeth in, with young Heather helping to look after her. 2 days later, Michael received a package from his deceased grandfather with instructions not to open it until the time was right. After that, Michael isolated himself in the Canadian wilderness, remaining there alone with his grief for 10 long years. Elizabeth, meanwhile, stayed with the McNeil family and was raised alongside Heather, her younger sister Becky, and her 6 brothers. In order to help support her parents and siblings, Heather began working for Amcan Petroleum when she was only 17 years old. She soon proved herself intelligent and capable, and was promoted to executive secretary for the vice president of R&D, Jerry Jackson. It was shortly after this that she first met James MacDonald Hudson, and despite being several years younger, was swiftly smitten. James, as we mentioned, was also working under Jackson, and by this point had spent 4 years developing his armored suit. However, he was shocked and disgusted to learn that Jackson intended on turning his designs over to the American military, so they could be adapted for combat and used in an ongoing conflict in Southeast Asia. Heather learned about this as well, but was forbidden from speaking out and resigned from the company in protest. James quit on the spot, but later that night he returned to the AMCAN building and donned his prototype armor. He used his machine to break into the company's vault and destroyed the original blueprints before any copies could be made. He then abandoned the suit on a nearby hilltop but took with him the cybernetic helmet, as it was the one piece he had designed before joining AMCAN. He returned to his modest apartment but realized that his rashness had left him bereft of cash and lacking in future prospects. He was pondering what to do when Heather knocked on his door to offer groceries and support. However, she quickly realized what had happened the previous night when she saw that James had the cybernetic helmet in his apartment. Wanting to stand by him, Heather confessed her feelings for James, which initially made him uncomfortable due to her relative youth. Despite this, it was Heather who came up with a plan, arranging a meeting with a representative of the Canadian government in Ottawa. The following day, strings were pulled and steps were taken to protect James from prosecution and ensure that he retained ownership of his cybernetic helmet. This, of course, was done because the Prime Minister wanted Hudson working for them instead. Over the following 3 years, James oversaw the creation of Department H, a top-secret branch of the Ministry of Defense. His government liaison was a man named Gary Cody, while his military contact was one Major Chasen. During this time, Department H worked on a number of secret projects, such as the Cosmic Ray Collector. And among the construction workers they employed during this time was the diminutive former adventurer Eugene Judd. James overlooked the plans for the Cosmic Ray Collector and, upon determining that the project was unsafe, recommended that it be shelved. However, the military officer in charge of the project, Major Jeremy Clark, was determined to continue. We'll come back to that in a bit, but in the meantime, let's turn our attention to the Northern Territory of Nunavut and the return of Richard Easton. After having spent what he thought was a single night with Nelvana in Quidlivin, he was shocked to learn that over 9 years had passed while he was gone. Overcome with madness and paranoia, Easton fled into the Arctic tundra, but we'll return to him a bit later. In the meantime, let's return to Michael Two Young Men and see what he was doing during all of this. After the death of his wife, he spent the better part of a decade alone in a cabin in the Canadian wilderness. Among his meager possessions was the mysterious package left to him by his grandfather, and eventually came the day that he decided to open it. As he did, the spirit of his grandfather emerged, declaring that he had delayed his own passage into the afterlife, but his time was short. It was then that Michael realized that the package he'd been holding for 10 years contained his grandfather's skull. Beneath it was a medicine bag that actually served as a conduit to a chaotic magical dimension called the Void. Finally ready to learn, Michael slowly embraced his heritage as his grandfather's spirit passed down his knowledge. Over the following weeks, he gained the ability to pull spells and mystical items from his medicine bag with a variety of different effects. He also learned to commune with spirits and learned of the goddess Nelvana's pregnancy. Drawn by mystic energies, he traveled north to an area near Resolute Bay in Nunavut. There, about 1 year after Easton's return, Michael performed a ceremony allowing Nelvana to speak with him. Using all of his skills, he acted as a midwife to the divine birth. While the half-goddess was born with the ability to change her shape, Michael was able to anchor her to the mortal world, allowing her to naturally assume a human form. Even so, the child was clearly unique, and in mere moments it was already the size of a 1-year-old. Becoming the girl's foster father, Michael named the child Naria, and over the following years she would continue to rapidly grow. In the meantime, let's check back in with James McDonald Hudson and Heather McNeil. As James worked on building Department H, Heather continued to pursue him romantically, and before too long he came to reciprocate the young woman's feelings. The two started a relationship, and soon he even agreed to marry her. However, Heather's Catholic parents disapproved of James primarily because of his work for the government. They also disagreed with his decision to elope and have their marriage officiated by a justice rather than a priest. Heather was similarly disheartened, but James promised her a proper wedding ceremony at a later date. Nonetheless, the two celebrated their union with a trip to Wood Buffalo National Park. But during this honeymoon, the newlyweds were attacked by a short, hairy, wild man who emerged from the woods. The strange man leapt on top of James, but Heather acted quickly, shooting their attacker in the back. Miraculously, the strange man survived these gunshots as his body began to heal. Unbeknownst to the Hudsons, he would have recovered more rapidly if not for the fact that his mutant healing abilities had already been severely overtaxed by an inhumane experiment. And I'm sure many of you watching already know who this is and what that experiment was. In any event, the couple were unwilling to simply leave him to die, and instead brought him back to their cabin. Unable to contact Department H, James went out to get help, while Heather watched over the recovering wild man. Several days later, the man awakened and cut himself free from the straps that held him down with retractable adamantium claws that emerged from his knuckles. Quickly realizing that the metal in his body could not have been natural, Heather took pity on the man and comforted him, keeping him calm until her husband returned. The man started to come to his senses as his mind slowly recovered from the trauma of what he'd gone through. His memories were fragmented and broken, but he did recall a name that he often went by, Logan. James, of course, took this opportunity to recruit Logan into Department H, making him their first superhuman operative, Weapon X, the Wolverine. Of course, he was far from the only superhuman in the world. While all of this was happening, a new age of heroes was dawning. One ushered in by the public debut of the Fantastic Four. Inspired by this, James decided to use Department H to create a Canadian superhero team. And so, as he turned his attention to those he could recruit to his cause, so too shall we, starting with a biophysicist named Walter Langowski. Born into a religious family in Vancouver, British Columbia, from a young age, Walter was more interested in science than faith. As an adult, he moved to the United States, where he attended Pennsylvania State University on a football scholarship. It was there that he met a fellow student named Bruce Banner, who had transferred to Penn State for a single semester. Despite Bruce's occasional anger issues, the two quickly became friends in the time they had together, with Walter taking an interest in Bruce's area of expertise, gamma radiation. After graduating, Walter pursued his own independent research, which he funded by playing football for the Green Bay Packers. This successful sporting career also earned him the attention of a stage actress named Veronica, and the two soon married and had a son. Meanwhile, in the New Mexico desert, Bruce Banner had started working with the U.S. military to construct a deadly weapon, the Gamma Bomb. During the initial testing of this device, there was an incident in which the bomb exploded while Banner was in range of what should have been a lethal dose of radiation. Banner miraculously survived, but was doomed to transform into the man-monster known as the Incredible Hulk. Before too long, the Hulk's identity was discovered and made public, and Walter Langowski learned what had become of his old friend. However, upon seeing the Hulk's raw physical power, he became determined to recreate the same level of gamma radiation under more controlled conditions. Leaving behind his football career, Walter earned a PhD in physics from MIT before returning to Canada and taking a teaching position at McGill University. In the midst of all of this, his home life became irrevocably strained, and Veronica divorced him, winning custody of their son. After that, he threw himself completely into his research, burning through the fortune he had amassed over his 3 years of professional sports. Eventually, he had nothing left and decided to take his project to the Canadian government. That, of course, is when he met James MacDonald Hudson and was recruited into Department H, which funded his continued endeavors. Sometime after that, Heather took James when she went to visit her former neighbor, Michael, 2 young men, in Banff National Park. Michael introduced the couple to his charge, Naria, who in just a few short years had grown to young adulthood. While there, Heather witnessed Naria's ability to shapeshift into any animal native to the north. The following morning, Michael explained her origins, as well as his own magical abilities. James, of course, was delighted by the happenstance, and recruited both Michael and Naria into Department H. Mind you, Michael agreed to this mostly so that Naria could receive an education and learn to better fit in with humanity. Other draftees included Saint Elmo, the allegedly immortal keeper of the Northern Lights. Supposedly millennia old, he possessed the ability to temporarily transform objects or people, including himself, into pure light. Next, we have Alexander Thorne, aka Smart Alec, who was considered the smartest man in Canada. Boasting multiple PhDs and the ability to mentally process information at computer-like speeds, Alec believed himself intellectually superior to even Mr. Fantastic. There was also Jodie Furman, or Stitch, a young non-verbal woman with the mutant ability to mentally manipulate small pieces of metal with incredible precision. Discovering her ability during puberty, Stitch developed egophobia, a terrible fear of herself and her own powers, and began to lash out at those around her. Jodie was not even their most difficult recruit, however, and next we have a young mutant named Kyle Gibney. Born in Vancouver, Kyle was kicked out of the house by his parents when he was just a teenager, forcing him to fend for himself. While living on the streets, he was abducted by a subversive organization called the Secret Empire. While being held captive, Kyle was emotionally tormented and experimented on. Using DNA from their master assassin, a mutant mercenary known as Wire, the Secret Empire sought to activate Kyle's latent abilities and transform him into a living weapon. Posing as a legitimate government agency, they employed the American psychologist Dr. Valerie Cooper, who spent months treating Kyle and gaining his trust, never knowing what was happening behind the scenes. When his violent tendencies started to emerge, the Secret Empire isolated him from Cooper, triggering his transformation into a more animalistic form. After that, Kyle Gibney was taken to a facility where he and others like him who had gone through similar transformations were collectively referred to as the Breed. These captives were trained by Wire, the mutant mercenary whose DNA was used to create them. However, Wire came to realize that the animalistic killers were becoming too uncontrollable and savage. Considering the whole endeavor a failure and regretting his part in it, Wire betrayed the Secret Empire, slaughtered the Breed, and demolished the facility. However, Kyle survived and escaped. Subsequently found by Department H, Kyle was recruited and took the code name Wild Child. Walter Langowski determined that Kyle was unfit for active duty because of the unpredictable nature of his dissociative identities, which ranged from functional to uncontrollably savage. Logan echoed these sentiments after Kyle badly slashed Jodie's face, leaving her scarred. However, James wanted to help Kyle, and his government superiors wanted him ready for service. Meanwhile, sometime after James's sudden departure from Amcan Petroleum, the company went belly up, allowing the Canadian government to confiscate Hudson's armor. With his original suit returned to him, James was able to rebuild it into a version he dubbed the Groundhog armor. Seeking someone to wear it, he recruited a Vancouver police officer, Sean Bernard, to serve as the suit's pilot. With that, Mac had enough champions to form Department H's first superhero team, the Flight. This initial group consisted of Groundhog, Stitch, Smart Alec, St. Elmo, and Naria, with Wolverine acting as their field leader. The neophyte super team would soon have their trial by fire when the American atomic scientist turned criminal mastermind Elias Starr, aka Egghead, constructed a nuclear weapon on the Canadian border and threatened to destroy New York City. With a cadre of supervillains dubbed the Emissaries of Evil in his employ, Egghead was challenged by Wolverine and the Flight. While the Flight ultimately succeeded in preventing the warhead from launching, Egghead had a backup plan in place and triggered the detonation sequence anyway. Fortunately, St. Elmo was able to save the day by converting the weapon into photonic energy that he could absorb. A blast that would have been a nuclear explosion instead became a harmless flash of light. However, doing so proved to be too much for the supposed god, and when the light subsided, Elmo was gone, having sacrificed his own immortal life to save his teammates. While disaster was averted, the mixed results of this mission would lead to the Flight being fundamentally restructured. Michael was furious with James and chewed him out for putting Naria onto the team without his permission. Meanwhile, Sean Bernard left Department H, declaring that if James wanted someone to wear the Groundhog armor, then he should do it himself. And that is exactly what he did. Standing alongside Weapon X, James MacDonald Hudson took the code name Weapon Alpha. In the midst of this, the day of James and Heather's oft-postponed wedding ceremony was swiftly approaching. When it finally arrived, James was contacted by his government liaison, Gary Cody, with another crisis. In the town of Orlew in eastern Ontario, Major Jeremy Clark's now completed cosmic ray collector was overcharging and threatening to rip open the fabric of space. During this time, Eugene Judd was working at the nearby Hull House orphanage, and upon witnessing the strange glow, rushed off to investigate. And so Weapon Alpha and Weapon X met with Clark and Judd at the site of the trouble. There, they encountered another Department H recruit, the wind-powered Chinook. Now, Chinook is said to be a legendary wartime hero, although any notable exploits have gone completely undocumented. In any event, his attempt to stop the cosmic ray collector completely backfired, causing him to be monstrously mutated and driven insane by the radiation. He threatened to destroy the Earth with a miniature black hole, but Eugene, Logan, and James worked together to stop him, knocking him into the cosmic ray collector. The three heroes were nearly sucked in as well, but Heather arrived in time to grab them, holding on until the machine collapsed. After that impressive display, Eugene departed without identifying himself to the others, although Heather took note of him. But there was no time to pursue him as, barely over an hour later, James and Heather finally had the Catholic wedding ceremony that they'd been planning for so long. After that, Mac continued working on his equipment, upgrading from the bulky Groundhog armor to a steel mesh suit. Covered in the colors of the Canadian flag and powered by the Earth's electromagnetic field, this new suit vastly increased James's strength and allowed him to fly at the speed of sound. It also generated a force field that protected him from both physical attacks and radiation, and gave him the ability to fire concussive blasts from his hands. With these new abilities and more, Weapon Alpha was ready to fight at the forefront of the next incarnation of the Flight. But first, he found his next recruits, and so now let us turn back time yet again and introduce another pair of characters. Twin siblings Jean-Paul and Jean-Marie Beaubier, who were born in Montreal, Quebec, to a French-Canadian named Jean-Baptiste Beaubier. Now, one story claims that their mother was an elven woman named Danae, but this information seems to have been largely disregarded as it was revealed by the unreliable god of mischief, Loki. Whether there is any truth to this or not, the twins lost their birth parents in a car crash when they were still infants. They were taken in by their relatives, the Martins, who were said to be cousins of their real mother. However, the Martins could not afford to care for both children, and so while Jean-Paul was formally adopted, Jean-Marie was sent to Madame Dupont's School for Girls, a Catholic institution in the city of Laval. Separated at such a young age, each twin grew up never knowing that the other existed. Furthermore, the Martins passed away before telling Jean-Paul about his sister, and at only 6 years old, the boy was sent to yet another foster home. Meanwhile, the nervous and introverted Jean-Marie grew increasingly depressed in the strict Catholic school. Despite reforms in the church itself, this particular institution continued to foster a harsh environment through the use of corporal punishment. At 13 years old, Jean-Marie decided she would end her own life by leaping from the roof of the building. But when she attempted to do so, she instead discovered her ability to fly at supersonic speeds. Not realizing that she was a mutant, she believed that her powers were a gift from God, and informed the head mistress, Sister Anne. However, Sister Anne was already distrustful of Jean-Marie because of the girl's pointed ears, and didn't believe her. After being called blasphemous for her claims, Jean-Marie was subjected to physical punishment before being forced to recite 1,000 Hail Marys and sent to bed without supper. The resulting trauma caused the shy, nervous girl to develop a form of dissociative identity disorder, as a much more extroverted and confident persona emerged. Jean-Marie left the school that night only to return 3 days later with makeup on her face and no memory of where she had been or what she had done. This led to yet more punishment from Sister Anne, forcing Jean-Marie Beaubier to repress her more outgoing and adventurous side. Meanwhile, a teenage Jean-Paul Martin was coming to terms with both the emergence of his own mutant powers as well as his homosexuality. Living on the street at the time, he was eventually caught stealing by a man named Raymond Belmond. Raymond saw the sadness that Jean-Paul was living with and took him in, becoming a much-needed friend and mentor. He introduced Jean-Paul to the world of professional skiing, which he used to practice his mutant super speed. But beneath the surface, Jean-Paul was still unsatisfied and continued seeking a place to belong. He spent some time working as a circus trapeze artist and came to regard his fellow performers as another surrogate family, but he eventually left them as well. Angry and frustrated, he found himself drawn to a separatist group, the Front de Libération du Québec. This led to him becoming a courier for a more extremist arm of the FLQ, Celle Combattre. Eventually, however, their radical methods proved too reckless for the young man. When one of their bombings threatened the lives of innocent civilians, Jean-Paul used his super speed to save them before leaving the group. Meanwhile, an 18-year-old Jean-Marie had completed her studies and was on her way to becoming a teacher at the school. She thought she had everything she wanted, but then her extroverted personality began to emerge once again. Letting her hair down and removing her glasses, Jean-Marie traveled to Montreal for a night on the town. Things seemed to take a turn for the worse when the provocatively dressed woman was pulled into a dark alley. But with super speed of her own, Jean-Marie was more than a match for the would-be assailants. Not only that, but the whole ordeal was witnessed by none other than Wolverine, who came to her aid. He then brought her back to Department H, where she met James MacDonald Hudson. By this point, Jean-Paul had returned to skiing and secretly used his powers to begin a prosperous career, ultimately becoming an Olympic gold medalist. Noticing the resemblance between them, not least of which being their similarly pointed ears, James investigated a possible connection and discovered that the two were siblings. After learning of his heritage, Jean-Paul abandoned the name Martin and reclaimed his original surname Beaubier. He was subsequently brought into Department H, where he came face to face with his long-lost twin sister. Overjoyed to have finally found each other, the two shook hands and discovered another facet of their shared powers. Not only did they have nearly identical abilities, but when the twins struck their hands together, it released a blinding flash of intense light. Another mutant discovered by Department H somewhere around this time was a man named Madison Jeffries. While born in Canada, both Madison and his younger brother Lionel enlisted in the American military during the Sin Kong War in Southeast Asia. Whereas Madison had the ability to mentally manipulate materials like metal, glass, and plastic, Lionel could do so with organic substances. As a result, Madison became a skilled mechanic, whereas Lionel was a medic. The two saw combat together, but things went bad on one mission when the rest of their squad was killed in an explosion. Lionel did his best to piece the mangled bodies back together, but it was all for naught. Resurrecting the dead was simply beyond his abilities. Unable to accept this, Lionel began to lose his mind, and Madison was forced to use his own powers to restrain him. Madison did not come out of the war unscathed either. Suffering from PTSD, he spent time in the awkwardly named Clinic for Socially Maladjusted Superbeings. From there, he was brought into Department H, who aided him with his recovery. And Jeffries wasn't the only patient from that facility that Department H recruited. There was also a brilliant engineer from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan named Roger Box. Having lost his legs in an undisclosed accident, Roger caught the notice of Department H after designing a humanoid robot simply named Box. The time was drawing closer for James to finalize the roster for his new superhero team, and he was excited for Logan to lead it alongside him. But then there was an incident in which the Incredible Hulk made his way north and crossed the border into Canada. Weapon X was sent to intervene, interrupting a fight between the Hulk and the cannibalistic Canadian creature called the Wendigo. While the ensuing battle essentially ended in a draw, this would be the first widely reported appearance of the Wolverine. And so when Professor Charles Xavier was putting together an all-new and all-different team of X-Men, he came to Logan with an offer. Having grown tired of government work and red tape, Wolverine agreed to go with him, much to Major Chasen's annoyance. James Hudson tried to convince him not to leave Department H, but Logan's mind was made up. After helping save many of the team's original members from the living island Krakoa, Logan remained with the X-Men in America, becoming a permanent member of the group. Sometime later, however, the Canadian government sent Weapon Alpha to bring him back. Logan and James ended up fighting, and the two were fairly evenly matched. However, when several other X-Men attempted to get involved, their civilian ally, Moira McTaggart, was hit by a stray blast. With the odds turning against him, James fled, disappointed in himself for inadvertently injuring an innocent person. Desiring vindication, he abandoned the codename Weapon Alpha and instead called himself Vindicator. Of course, he also needed to find a replacement for Wolverine, and so now let's look at the remaining Department H recruits we have yet to mention, starting with Marina Smallwood. While born on Earth, Marina was descended from an alien race called the Plodex. When their own homeworld suffered from overpopulation, the Plodex sent their eggs out into the universe to colonize other planets by adapting the DNA of their dominant life forms. However, when one of these ships came to Earth roughly 40,000 years ago, a malfunction caused it to crash. The eggs were released before they were ready, and as a result, most of them perished. One did survive, however, and over the following centuries it drifted across the ocean, the adaptable fetus within becoming amphibious. Millennia later, off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, a fishing trawler called the Mary D was caught up in a terrible storm. The first mate, Thomas Smallwood, was thrown overboard and found the glowing Plodex egg. After being recovered from the torrential waters, the curious Thomas brought the strange egg back to his family home on Random Island. There, his wife Gladys examined the egg and noticed the moving creature inside. As the Plodex hatched, it copied Gladys's genetic information, becoming a human-alien hybrid. The Smallwoods named this child Marina and raised her as their own alongside their son Daniel. Despite her unusual appearance, Marina grew up happy and accepted in the small rural community of Lady Cove. Then, when she was 16 years old, she discovered her ability to swim at superhuman speeds. 10 months after that, her foster brother, Dan Smallwood, contacted the Ministry of Defense, which led to Marina being recruited by Department H. Over the following 3 years, she proved herself both physically and intellectually as she completed her training. Next, we have Flashback. Originally an actor from Manitoba named Gardner Munro, Flashback had the mutant power to summon alternate versions of himself from possible future timelines. Then there's Lillian Crawley, or Diamond Lil. She was a 6'4" waitress from Yellowknife with a mutant invulnerability power that also dulled her sense of touch. Finally, let's check back in with some of the characters that we've already introduced. During this time, Dr. Michael Two Young Men was working as a staff physician at the Sarcee Reserve Hospital just outside Calgary. He also used his magical powers and medicine bag as the mystic hero Shaman. Meanwhile, his shape-shifting half-goddess foster daughter, Naria, took the code name Snowbird. James Hudson also helped her establish a human identity as Corporal Anne Mackenzie, a records officer for the RCMP in Yellowknife. Jean-Marie Bobier learned to manage her dissociative identity disorder, and her gentle persona did indeed become a teacher at the Catholic school she grew up in. Her other self took the name Aurora and served as an agent of Department H alongside her brother, who became known as North Star. As for Eugene Judd, since we last left him, he had fallen back into bad habits of barroom brawls and prison time. However, he was found by Heather Hudson, who arranged his release and brought him to Department H. While he had the skills necessary to join the active team that James was building, his checkered history relegated him to the training division, where he again adopted the codename Puck. Walter Langowski, meanwhile, had gotten the funding to continue his gamma research in an isolated lab near the Arctic Circle. After several years of preparation and study, he exposed himself to a controlled dose of gamma radiation. However, while doing so, he unknowingly pierced the mystic barrier leading to the realm of the beasts. He formed a mystic connection with the great beast Tanarak, and so instead of becoming a traditional Hulk, he was transformed into an orange-furred monster similar in appearance to Tanarak. Overcome with pain, he ran out into the tundra, but ultimately passed out and reverted to human form. He was found the following morning by Snowbird, who brought him to a hospital and contacted James and Michael. Snowbird then taught Walter to control his transformations, and he subsequently maintained his personality in furry form. He eventually learned to change back and forth without any pain and took the codename Sasquatch. And with Sasquatch deemed a suitable replacement for Wolverine, James McDonald Hudson was ready to finalize the roster for his new superhero team. But in order to prevent further losses like what happened with St. Elmo, this new version of the flight was split into 3 divisions. Gamma Flight consisted of raw recruits and those least ready for active duty. This included Madison Jeffries, Smart Alec, Diamond Lil, and Wild Child. Beta Flight was a group of heroes who were still in training but had proven their efficacy. Puck, Marina, Box, and Flashback were all placed in this level. The primary team Alpha Flight were the ones who would fight alongside Vindicator as Canada's first line of defense against superhuman threats. This included North Star, Aurora, Snowbird, Shaman, and Sasquatch. In their earliest recorded mission, Alpha Flight made another attempt to capture Wolverine by luring the X-Men to Calgary. This time Logan surrendered and allowed himself to be captured to end the ensuing battle. However, the truck had scarcely driven away before Wolverine escaped and returned to his allies. Nonetheless, Logan knew that this wouldn't be the end of it and later decided to return to Canada to settle things. In the meantime, there was an incident in the wilderness of northern Quebec where RCMP officer Joe Parnall was camping with his family beside Big Moose Creek near the Hudson Bay. During this trip, the family was attacked by a large, furry creature, and Officer Joe Parnall was killed. 6-year-old Tommy Parnall narrowly escaped, but when the authorities investigated, they found no sign of Joe's wife Eileen or their infant daughter. Furthermore, when Alpha Flight got involved, they quickly ruled out the possibility of the assailant being a bear based on a footprint taken at the scene. They began their investigation, during which their forces were cut in half, much to Vindicator's frustration. You see, while all this was happening, an American presidential candidate named Miles Brickman was running a smear campaign against the android hero known as Machine Man. Hoping to bolster his political career, he tricked Department H into believing that the Machine Man was a threat to Canada as well. As a result of Brickman's manipulations, Sasquatch, Aurora, and North Star were sent to the United States to stop the supposed menace. Meanwhile, Heather Hudson returned home one day to find Wolverine waiting for her along with his teammate Nightcrawler. She was excited to see him, and as a result, Nightcrawler was actually the first of the X-Men to learn that his name was Logan. Heather also told Wolverine where to find James and the others, and so he joined them in their investigation. He quickly deduced that the creature they were seeking was none other than the Wendigo, the cannibalistic creature that he'd encountered during his first bout with the Hulk. Working together with the members of Alpha Flight, Wolverine also helped to find and rescue the missing woman and child. In the end, it was Snowbird who defeated the Wendigo, fittingly by taking the form of an actual Wolverine. With the creature subdued, Shaman was able to expel the Wendigo spirit from the human host it inhabited, George Baptiste. With that case solved and the hatchet buried, Logan and James parted ways as friends once again, putting an end to any lingering animosity between Alpha Flight and the X-Men. Meanwhile, in New York City, the others were having less success in their battle with the Machine Man. But while their target ultimately escaped, a Canadian super spy known simply as Agent K was secretly conducting an investigation of his own. He learned that Senator Brickman had tricked Department H into launching an attack on the Machine Man as part of a plot to further his own political career. After that, Alpha Flight withdrew and Agent K leaked evidence to the media that Brickman was guilty of conspiring with foreign governments to rig elections. Things were going relatively well, and two members of Beta Flight, Puck and a now 20-year-old Marina, were both considered eligible for promotion to Alpha. However, before that could happen, Alpha Flight was faced with what would prove to be their toughest challenge yet: budget cuts. In spite of everything that James McDonald Hudson had fought for and built, when the Ministry of Defense had its funding reduced, Department H was shuttered, and Alpha Flight was disbanded. The Prime Minister allowed the heroes to keep their security clearance and status as RCMP auxiliaries, but they would receive no further support from the Canadian government. And so the members of Alpha Flight went their separate ways, returning to their individual lives and jobs. Now, this would be an anticlimactic ending indeed, but if you recall, we still have a loose end to address in this video. And so we turn our attention northward to Resolute Bay in Nunavut. There we find Snowbird's human father, Richard Easton, who by this point had gone quite mad. Mad enough, in fact, to perform a mystic ritual to summon one of the long-imprisoned great beasts. Using the ancient headband that he had unearthed so many years prior, he sought to prove himself right, but instead sacrificed his own life. From the land itself, the great beast Tundra emerged and walked the earth for the first time in thousands of years. James was contacted by his former government liaison, Gary Cody, and rushed off to investigate without a team to back him up. However, Heather was unwilling to let her husband go alone and quickly alerted the remaining members of Alpha Flight from a secret room in their Ontario home. This included both Marina and Puck, who eagerly leapt into action, although the latter of which was unable to get transportation to Nunavut in time to reach the battle. In any event, Sasquatch, North Star, Aurora, Shaman, Snowbird, and Marina all joined Vindicator in the battle against the Great Beast. Despite being the team's newest member, Marina soon proved instrumental in Tundra's defeat, generating a water spout that Shaman used to mystically dissolve the physical form that Richard Easton had created for the monster, leaving its spirit trapped in the realm of the beasts. After that, the team reconvened at James and Heather's home in Ottawa and unanimously agreed to continue working together with or without government funding. Although without Beta or Gamma Flight, they pondered coming up with a new name to use while acting as free agents. But then there was a knock on the door as Puck had finally caught up with the others. Having trained hard to become a member of Alpha Flight, he insisted that the team keep its name, and the others agreed. Although when Walter jokingly referred to Eugene Judd as a mascot, the two got into a bit of a scuffle. Nonetheless, this is where we end our story for today, but of course in many ways this was just the beginning for Canada's premier superhero team. After this, there would be many other adventures, changes to the roster, deaths and revivals, and further clashes with the great beasts. Upon going independent, James Hudson abandoned the name Vindicator and instead became known as Guardian. Eventually, Heather would don a similar suit of her own and take over the mantle of Vindicator. Meanwhile, Shaman's daughter, Elizabeth Two Young Men, ultimately accepted her mystical heritage as well, becoming known as Talisman. But if you want to know about those stories and more, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Because, as I said, this was only the beginning. This was the origin of Alpha Flight. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any amount on any of these platforms, you will get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there is anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, True Believers, Excelsior!